Good evening. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Mariah Mason. I am on the public engagement team at the Division of Fish and Wildlife with the Indiana DNR. And today I'm here to introduce Brad Westrich, our state mammalogist. He will be talking with us about bats and how to become more familiar with bats. It's going to be super exciting. And I am also going to be doing the behind the scenes work today, so periodically you all may hear my voice, disembodied voice, kind of speaking up and voicing your questions out loud to Brad so that he may have the chance to answer those. That's me. So Brad will be on screen most of the evening. Please note that there is a Q&A functionality for this presentation, so you should be able to navigate to that in your toolbar and type in questions, which we can then either answer or relay out verbally, so that Brad can answer for the whole group. And there we will also be putting announcements, links, things like that in the chat for you all as additional resources. So without further ado, here's Brad Westrich, our state mammalogist.
All right. Thank you very much, Mariah. I appreciate that. So welcome to this webinar series, Become a Bat Master. That's a tall order for less than an hour that I have you guys with me. Maybe you won't become a bat master. Maybe you're coming to this with some curiosity about bats. Maybe you already know about bats and you want to learn a little bit more, and maybe you just want to find out what you can do to help bats here in Indiana. And hopefully we can cover all that today. What I really want to do is help you change your perception of bats. Hopefully there's no negative perceptions about bats out there, but that's my goal, changing perceptions of bats. And if you can take that knowledge, share it with your friends and family too, that's perfect. So let's get into it. There we go. So most of us have, these childhood introductions to bats, and it involves something similar to this. Bats come up as a theme, maybe a decoration, maybe it's something spooky around Halloween time. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of us are introduced to that as very formidable children. This imprints on us, and we think of bats as maybe spooky things because they're tied to myth and lore and legend. And unfortunately, that really sticks with people. I've encountered a lot of people in this position who have a lot of hesitancy about bats and having bats around them because they sort of have these negative connotations towards this group of species. And for people who didn't come across bats this way when they were children, maybe they came across bats as an adult. Maybe they were on their way to work and they found a bat on their porch and it was dead. They didn't know what to do with it, and so they thought, hey, this animal must be sick. So then they think all bats are sick animals. Or maybe you see this sickly looking young bat here on a wall of your house or on the wall of an office building downtown. And you think, hey, what happened to that animal? Why is it out here in the middle of the day? It must be sick. Or perhaps, you're putting something up in your attic, seasonal decorations, or getting something down, and you come across a scene like this, where you see guano piles here and there. You're not sure what it is. You start looking around, and through your investigation, maybe you find out you have bats roosting in your attic seasonally or year-round. And that can be very stressful too. And so you throw that stress into everyday life, and to some people, bats can become a nuisance. And so what I'm here to do today is to try to show you that bats are definitely not a nuisance. They are something that we benefit from greatly, and they provide a lot of really good free services for us. So hopefully we can change those perceptions. So as people encounter bats, I get this question asked a lot. They're like, what is a bat? To them, bats are, these shadowy figures that fly out at night, and they're nocturnal, so they're sort of out of sight, out of mind. We don't get to see them often or interact with them like we do other wildlife. And, to other people, they see them as small floofs that are rather adorable. So that people want to know, what is a bat exactly? They want to know, do bats hang upside down all the time? And for the most part, yeah, they do. But sometimes you get goofy bats like this. And actually, bats are very clean animals. And they don't actually like to urinate or defecate when they're hanging upside down. So what they'll do is flip over on their thumbs, like this animal here you see, and they'll urinate and defecate on the ground and stay very clean themselves. And then other times you have bats that just snooze a lot. And that's a really good way to save energy. So this bat here is an Indiana bat, and this one was currently hibernating, but you have bats in the summer months that may actually go into this light version of hibernation called torpor. And that's essentially their ability to go to sleep for a couple of days without eating, because why expose yourself to predators when you don't need to? So what is a bat? Well, although some people report them to me as birds, they are definitely a mammal. So a mammal is something that is warm-blooded, It has fur, it gives birth to live young, and they have mammary glands and produce milk for the young. And here on the screen, you can see an eastern red bat with 3 pups. And this is pretty extreme to have this many pups for a bat. Most bats, they're very small animals, especially here in Indiana, they're very small. They have long lifespans, anywhere between 5 and 40 years, and they usually only produce 1 to 2 young. Now, getting those animals to survive, their young to survive, beyond a year can be very difficult. So usually you only have a bat that has 1 successful pup a year. So it can take a long time for bats to recover population numbers should something bad happen to them. But what really makes a bat, and what kind of throws some people off, is that they have some pretty cool bat adaptations. One of those being the ability to fly. So prior to bats, the only things that could fly were insects and birds. Then bats evolved. They came onto the scene and they had these very long arms, very long fingers with skin attaching in between all those fingers all the way back to their body. And that enabled them to be able to use new habitats, to move quickly between landscape and landscape and start utilizing new areas. And because of that, they diversified across the world. And it really makes them awesome. So unlike birds, bats have solid bones. And these bones are rather heavy. And because bats have evolved their own form of flight, it's not the most elegant form of flight like birds or some insects. So because of this, they're sort of clumsy. And although this photo or this video of bats flying out of Bracken Cave near San Antonio, Texas, although it looked like they were flying pretty smooth, some of them were probably bumping into each other and not looking so graceful. But flight for bats is very energy expensive, so they need to eat a lot of insects or fruit or nectar, depending on what this animal eats, in order to maintain that flight. Another cool adaptation that bats have is echolocation. So that's the ability to produce some sort of a sound and have that sound bounce off of objects, come back to them, and they can essentially map out their environment that way. And in bats, they're using this to not only map out, complex canopies in forests, though they can fly through there without hitting any branches, but they're also using it to find their food sources. And in the case of this bat you see here on the screen, it's finding an insect. And they can get a lot of detail from these echolocation calls. So on the bottom left of your screen, you should see some spectrograms of 2 different bat calls. So echolocation calls can be unique to each bat species, and we can use this to identify the species. The one on top is sort of showing you steeper slopes going from high frequency to low frequency rather quickly. And this bat I'd interpret as being able to utilize those more canopy closed in habitats. It's having to navigate, tight spaces between twigs and leaves, things like that, as it's searching for insects, compared to the bat on the bottom, which has more low frequency calls. And to me, that shows that this bat is foraging in more open areas, maybe forest edges, over pastures or agricultural fields, things like that. So you can really learn a lot about the bats themselves based on these echolocation calls. So that ability to fly and that ability to echolocate has really led to some amazing bat diversity across the globe. Of all the mammals on Earth, there are over 5,000 species. Bats make up more than 1/5 of that. So there are more than 1,400 species of bats on Earth. And they occur almost everywhere, except for the extreme polar regions in the north and the south. Around the equator, you have the greatest diversity of bats because you have very diverse habitats. You have numerous food sources for them to utilize. And then as you go closer to the poles, that diversity drops off. Here's a better look at that bat richness going from the equator, where it's really thick, towards the poles, where it sort of thins out a little bit. So one of the common questions that I get is, what do bats do? And that usually comes from a place of a little bit of frustration because people have encountered bats maybe living in their attic, and it's sort of put a hamper on their day. And so there's like, what do bats even do? And I think the more appropriate way to respond to that is, what don't bats do? Because they do so much for us. And a lot of people just really don't know what bats do and how they benefit their everyday life, honestly. So what are the value of bats? Well, the value of bats is amazing. With this diversity of bats across the world, they provide so many free ecosystem services to us. Just a couple of examples. Bats are huge tourism boons for many places around the world. On the left here, I have examples from Austin, Texas, where there are literally festivals around the Mexican free-tailed bat. I have an example from Mammoth Cave there and Carlsbad Caverns, where you can not only explore the caves where bats are going into, defecating, releasing nutrients, and essentially being the wellspring of life in those environments, but also where people can watch bats emerge from the caves and truly enjoy them. Additionally, in certain portions of the world, people can actually mine guano beneath bat colonies and sell that for fertilizer. It's excellent fertilizer for gardens, it's high in nutrients, and plants absolutely love it. And finally, with the bat diversity out there, I mentioned that bats can live for a long time, which is kind of unique for a very small animal. Most small animals you think of, like mice and rats, they only live for a year to maybe 5 years. They have very short lifespans, they produce a lot of young, and that's because their DNA degrades rather quickly. Bats, on the other hand, have DNA that stays intact for a long time. So if we can sort of crack the code on what makes a bat live so long, it might provide some really good cues into human medical science. In addition to that, some bat saliva, like vampire bat saliva, has anti-clotting factors in it that we can potentially use in medicine, so stroke medication, things like that, to help humans. It's just a matter of time before we can really harness some of these abilities that bats have and apply it to the human world, especially in medicine. But there are many more values of bats, so let's get into that. Bats definitely pollinate many human food sources and other sources of food for other animals out there. So there are hundreds of plants that are reliant on bats to pollinate them. Some of these plants occur dozens, if not 50 or 100 miles apart from one another. So there's no way that a butterfly or a moth can pollinate those individual plants in a given night or day. And some of these plants actually only bloom at night, so it really limits who can pollinate them. And as you can see here on the picture on the left, some bats have very, very long tongues that are adapted to specific species of plants so that they can get the nectar at the very base of that flower while covering themselves in pollen and then moving on to the next flower. Bats are also very important for dispersing seeds across rainforests and other areas, in areas where there are deforestation going on for mining, agriculture, livestock, things like that. Bats have actually been shown to bring plants back into that area, trees in particular, before any other seed dispersers. So before mice, before birds. And that's because these bats are flying around at night and defecating seeds that they've processed within a half an hour of actually eating the fruit of that same tree. And they're defecating those seeds into these clear-cut areas because the only predators they're worried about are owls and things like that. So a clear cut beneath them doesn't scare them away the same way it would a bird or a rodent. And finally, eating insects. This is a huge service that bats provide humans worldwide. Insectivorous bats can be present in North America, in the tropics, down in South America too. And these bats are eating things like beetles and moths, mosquitoes, things that we typically think of as sometimes annoyances, but that can also be vectors of disease. So there are some bugs that may move pathogens to plants or between plants, causing blights and things like that. Some of these insects, like mosquitoes, may even be a vector of disease for livestock or to humans. And so having a healthy insectivorous bat population in your area is actually beneficial for human health, as well as the health of forests around you and wildlife around you, which can then lead to increased water quality and air quality too, which only has added benefits for humans. So if I haven't sold you on the value of bats yet, let's go through this. Did you know that there was a study recently that looked at the effects of bats on agricultural fields in North America? And so in this experiment, they excluded bats from one portion of the field and they excluded birds from the other portion of the field. And they allowed one of the organisms to feast during the day and the other during the night. And they found that the portion where bats were able to eat all the insects, that portion had higher yield of fruit, as well as fewer pesticides were utilized on that crop to get them to that point. So if you combine those two factors of a greater crop yield and fewer pesticides used, plus all the costs associated with distributing those pesticides, things like that, that bats provide at least $23 billion in savings every year in North America. So actually putting a monetary value to this, it really shows you how important bats are in North America. And if you apply that to some of the other services that I've described so far, it really becomes difficult to try to come up with a number to show just how valuable bats are. So how many bat species live near you? Well, in North America, there are about 154 bat species. That's down from Mexico all the way up through Canada. As you get closer to Indiana, there's about 14 species of bats. And all the bats that we have here are insectivorous, so they eat insects all the time. And where might these bats live? You might be wondering. So they live in a number of habitats. And honestly, it depends on the time of year, too. So this bat on the bottom, it's a cave-dwelling bat in the winter. Sometimes you can find them in caves in the summer, but they also utilize leaves in the summer. So they will roost in the foliage of trees during the summer months as well. The bat here in the middle is utilizing cracks and crevices between bark on a tree, maybe like some exfoliating bark on the tree, or even cavities where branches have broken out, or even hollows that were created by squirrels or woodpeckers. And then the bat on the top left is actually roosting in the canopy of the tree. And a lot of our migratory bats are going to do this. They're going to roost in foliage at the very tops of trees. Some of them are even going to roost in foliage down at like knee height or even under leaf litter. Now, there are some very entrepreneurial bats out there that have adapted to life with humans. And so you can even find these bats in structures that we've put out there. And you got to admit, some of these structures look pretty cave-like. They have very consistent temperatures in the winter, depending on where they go in there at least. And so these bats could potentially be in the rafters or the attic. Other bats have used the underside of bridges, both wood and concrete. So we've sort of changed the landscape a lot, but we've also changed it in such a way that it has helped some species find additional roosts where maybe their roost was lost previously. So I had mentioned there are 14 species of bats here in Indiana, and one of those, the big brown bat, is abundant. That one's doing fairly well here in the state. What I really want you to notice here on this slide is that we have this large grouping of bats that are under this title of SGCN, or Species of Greatest Conservation Need. And that sort of breaks down into two groupings, special concern and state endangered. And those are the bats that I spend a lot of time working with. Those are the bat species that require the most attention in terms of monitoring, and then they need the most management too, so that we can help curb any negative population effects that might be happening to them. And we'll get into some of that shortly. On this list, you'll also notice that all of our state endangered bats include the federally endangered ones too. So the Indiana bat, the gray bat, and the northern long-eared bat. So let's meet some of these animals. When you get them up close, you can really see a lot of the details that make them very unique compared to seeing them fly off through the forest or over the forest where you can't see much about them. But up close, they have personalities. They're very cute. They have the migratory bats all on this screen. So all of these animals do exactly what monarch butterflies do. They do exactly what birds do. They migrate from Central America or the Gulf Coast states all the way up to Indiana in the spring and summer months. They may even fly past Indiana, just use us for a stopover spot to fuel up. They'll move off into Canada where they will spend their summers feasting on insects, getting really fat, raising their young, teaching them important life skills before they move on back down in the south during the autumn months. The eastern red bat on this slide is probably the most common of the migratory bat species we have here. Now, the other way that you can survive the cold winter climate that Indiana has to offer is to hibernate. So these bats on this slide, they actually opt to go underground to avoid the very harsh winter months. And they follow a pretty similar life history as those migratory ones, where they will spend their spring and summer months trying to get as fat as they can so that in the late fall, they can enter hibernation and just live off of those fat stores for most of that month. But what's really interesting is during hibernation, these bats are actually, shutting down a lot of very important body functions. So they're slowing down their heart rate, they're slowing down their respiration rate, even their metabolism and their immune system so that they can run on as little fuel as possible. But they do this in like 2-week bursts. So they'll wake up about every 2 weeks, maybe groom themselves, fly off, find some water, and then go back into hibernation, possibly in another spot, if not the same spot. And on this screen, the tricolored bat is one of the smallest bats we have here in the state. Here are some more of our hibernating bats, the gray bat, northern long-eared bat, and eastern small-footed bat. Of note, which is pretty interesting, is the gray bat is also federally endangered, and this is a species that is increasing its range northward. So they used to occur very rarely in Indiana, in southern Indiana in particular, but now they're starting to occur in greater numbers, and we're seeing them in more caves too, which is very exciting to be a part of this species, hopefully recovery. And finally, we have the Indiana bat, the bat that has our namesake, right? This is a very social bat. So whenever we go into caves, we see them in large clusters like this. And you can get, 300 bats or more into a very small area, an area about the size of a dinner plate. So we go into these caves in the winter and we try to time these surveys across the entire Indiana bat range to get a snapshot of how the entire population is doing in one single moment. And so we go into these caves and we can, count these bats when they're in small clusters. But it becomes really interesting when these bats are like this. They're not in a small cluster anymore. They're in a very large mat on the ceiling of the cave above us. And so one of the very important things we try to do is minimally disturb these bats while we're doing these winter surveys. And fortunately, technology has helped us do that recently. So we can use digital photography to go into these caves, take photos of all these bats hibernating, and get out of the cave as quickly as possible so we're not disturbing bats for too long. And we try to do this not very often either. So we don't do it every year. We do it every couple of years so that these bats have a chance to recover and come back to these caves without feeling like they're being bothered by humans too much. So in addition to some areas really celebrating bats, Austin has bat fests that are centered around the Mexican free-tailed bat. There are some states that have state mammals. Actually, most states have state mammals. There are only 3 states that don't. Texas actually has a state flying mammal in addition to 2 others, but that flying mammal is the Mexican free-tailed bat. And Virginia actually has a state mammal that is the Virginia big-eared bat. So wouldn't it be nice if there were a mammal out there that Indiana could make a state mammal, if only one had a name that would really fit that bill? Unfortunately, that's nothing DNR can do. It's only something that a governor proclamation or legislators can do. So you know who to bother. Now, I've told you a lot about the bats and where they live, but how are they doing? That's a very good and relevant question to ask. So how are the bats doing here in Indiana? And I wish I had better news. I mean, it could be better. It's not all bad, but it could be better. And what we're going to share here in the chat and the Q&A is this State of the Bats report. This is something that was put together by Bat Conservation International, and it's a State of the Bats in North America to give you an idea of how they're doing, what major threats they're facing, how you can help them, and how they're being helped by organizations like Bat Conservation International. So feel free to check out that resource as you like, but let's get into this because all of these threats are very relevant to what's going on here in Indiana too. So the number 1 threat to a lot of these bats, the hibernating bats at least, is disturbance in the winter months. So I mentioned that bats sort of shut everything down and they need to very effectively budget their fat resources throughout the winter months. This is essentially what you see sort of sped up across one day, looking at a cluster of bats as they wake up slowly, they fly off, get a drink, they come back, they might go into hibernation. They'll drop back down to a temperature that's pretty close to what the temperature is of the rock around them. And then some of them might wake up or they're just going to be down for the next 2 weeks until they wake up again. But they need to carefully limit how much energy they use every time they wake up so that they can last throughout all of hibernation, which can last for, 5, 6, or even 7 months in some places. And so when you go into a cave, these bats, they're not blind. They're responding to a lot of cues we're giving off. So they're responding to the light, as you can see here in this video. They're starting to move around. It's bothering them. They're starting to turn on some of those body functions that they need to evade a predator. And every time that there's a disturbance like this in the cave, they wake up and they burn those very valuable resources and they try to find someplace safer to roost. So if we can limit cave disturbance of bats, we can actually help these bats survive these critical winter months. Now, extreme weather can always be a threat to any wildlife, but as we're having more and more extreme weather events, both in the winter that's too cold in certain areas where it shouldn't be this cold, or in the summer when it's just getting hotter and hotter and these extreme heat events are affecting, unfortunately, bats, in addition to many other things, What I have here is an example of two bat boxes on the right. One of them's painted black, the other one's brown. Now, the idea behind people doing this is so that you can get two different temperatures within your bat boxes. The black box is going to get a little hotter during the day compared to the brown box. Now, that's okay. There's a lot of experimentation that's been going on around this. And in northern latitudes, you definitely want to have a darker box to absorb that solar radiation and provide heat for those bats throughout the night. But what happens is when you have these extreme heat events, this box could actually become a heat trap to bats and end up killing them. So we're having to put a lot of effort and money into research towards effective bat boxes that can withstand these extreme heat waves, because it's not just, one-off bats that utilize bat boxes. We've been finding more maternity colonies in bat boxes. So that's groups of females who utilize these boxes to give birth and raise their young, because it's a very warm, protected environment. And unfortunately, it's those young that end up dying because they can't handle that heat and they can't fly away yet. Now, the next threat sort of tied to that is wind energy. So as you have these extreme heat and extreme cold events caused by climate change and changes to typical weather patterns, the natural response is to go more towards renewable energy. And unfortunately, renewables like wind have been shown to be a mortality source for bats, unfortunately, migratory bats in particular. And so currently the map on the left is showing you what Indiana has in terms of solar output. And with a drive to get further away from fossil fuels, we know that this output is going to be pushed higher. And so it's anticipated that we're going to more than double our wind energy outputs by 2050. And if we can't find a way to help mitigate the bat loss by wind energy by that time, unfortunately, we're going to have significant mortality of these migratory bats, and that would just be catastrophic for those populations. White nose syndrome, unfortunately, is affecting our hibernating bats too. So white nose syndrome was first detected here in Indiana in 2011. And essentially what this fungus does is it grows on these bats as soon as they enter hibernation. It kind of grows on them like athlete's foot would on a human. It's a skin fungus, so it just grows in and out of the skin. And what you're seeing on the nose and wings of these animals is the fungal bodies erupting from the skin so that they can spread spores throughout the environment. And so this causes bats to wake up a lot more often than they naturally would. And that causes bats, unfortunately, to burn through those fat reserves that they've so carefully stored up at least twice as fast, so that they are starving halfway through hibernation and they have to go find food. Well, unfortunately, in the middle of winter, there aren't insects outside, so they either go outside and freeze to death or they starve inside the cave. And so as we were watching our bats during our hibernacula surveys in the winter, we saw, as white nose syndrome hit the state and was first detected, the years following, we had some catastrophic crashes of certain species. So white nose syndrome doesn't affect every bat species the same way. Some bats are affected more steeply than others. And in this example, the little brown bat and the tricolored bat, they lost about 90% of their populations because of this. Now, the Indiana bat and big brown bats, they weren't affected as badly, fortunately, but this is what we were able to observe with a lot of the monitoring that we do. And the final threat that bats face is a lot of, it's based in humans again, but it's fear that's driven by myths. So it's misunderstanding what this animal is. It's, fear of seeing one in your house and accidentally killing it instead of, opening a door so it can get outside. All these things add up the more interactions there are with people on the environment. And so if we can, take these bats that are usually out of sight and out of mind and talk about them, praise some of the amazing resources and free services that they do a little bit more, maybe we can change that perception of bats nationally, globally, or even just within your family. Now, I know a lot of that was doom and gloom, but it's not all bad. So in recent years, we have been seeing some signs of recovery. It'll be a long, slow road to recovery for some of these species, but we are starting to see signs that white nose syndrome is something that's not causing huge mortality anymore. They're living with it. And as I mentioned, gray bats are increasing in the state very quickly, utilizing new caves that they haven't used previously and showing up in caves that they did use in much larger numbers. So how does DNR fit into all this? Well, we fit into it with a lot of monitoring, followed by research and management. And so we're monitoring these caves and the summer habitat that these bats use, the forests. We're conducting research to see if there are better forest management practices that we can use that will help bats while still accomplishing the goals that we have as a human society to advance, to learn. And then the monitoring and research will inform management decisions that we put on the ground to help this species survive. As we go through this, we always reevaluate what we learned. So what was successful, what worked well, what were the failures, what shouldn't we try again, or how can we learn from those? And we roll that all into a learning exercise, and then we repeat this. So then we can improve monitoring and improve research based on what we learned, and then improve management for the species. So an example of this with the white nose syndrome example that we've been going through is, we've been monitoring a lot of these caves for about 30 or 40 years in some cases. So we were able to document when white nose exactly got to these caves. We were able to see the effects that it had on the local bat population across Indiana's landscape and across the landscape that Indiana bats use. And then we were able to conduct research on these bats and the fungus, and then implement management strategies to help these bats survive. And in that case, it was installing bat gates on certain caves that they really heavily relied on. And some of these bats even changed how they were using the caves. So we had to move bat gates to help protect these guys from winter disturbance. And we didn't do it alone. So I'm part of DNR within Division of Fish and Wildlife Resources. And there are many other divisions. So there's state parks, there's forestry, and we work together to help bats and come up with management strategies and research projects that are going to inform better management of the species. But we don't do it alone either. So we have many land trusts that we work with, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USGS, and other bat interested groups. And that's still not enough. So on this map you see here in the middle, the green highlighted areas are all the state and federal properties here in the state. And that means the rest of Indiana is privately owned. So a lot of the help that we need and a lot of good help that we get comes from Hoosiers, but we could always use more as long as you're willing. So some of the current monitoring efforts that I would really like to seek some help out on from you out in the public is some acoustic monitoring projects we have ongoing, as well as summer roost monitoring. So let's get into some of that. What I'm going to cue up here is a video of what it looks like on the back end. So we run these acoustic surveys with microphones on top of our cars that are picking up the ultrasonic frequencies bats are using for echolocation. And I mentioned earlier that bats have echolocation that is unique to a species. And so this little video is going to go through a couple of the species, showing you how different those echolocation signatures are for each species. The sounds are slowed down and lowered to a frequency that we can hear here. So first you saw a big brown, the next was an eastern red, and then this is an evening bat. And if the sound didn't come through, I can replay it here in a little bit.
Thank you, Brad. I think I'm having some issues with sound, so if we could try to replay that. I want to go ahead and apologize. This is our first time doing a webinar with this new platform, which is super exciting and hopefully means that we'll be able to provide a lot more content opportunities in the future, but we are working out bugs, so please bear with us.
All right, I may come back to it just so I can get through all the content, but I definitely want people to be able to hear this because it sounds pretty cool. All right, so with these acoustic surveys, we're able to cover a lot of the state. We have had probably 20 to 30 very excellent mobile surveyors who have helped us out in the past and who currently help us out too. And essentially what we're doing is, driving around in our personal vehicles with a microphone on the roof, going very slow at night on back roads that are pretty safe, listening for bats. And so we analyze the data as it comes into us. And what you can see is that in this pre-white nose map here in the middle, you have different colors that correspond to species groups. And so what I really want you to pay attention to is the yellow color and the green color. And you see here, pre-white nose syndrome, you have yellow and green bats present in northern Indiana, and after white nose, you really lost those bats from the area. And then in southern Indiana, those bats are present, but at a much lower number compared to pre-white nose syndrome. So it was kind of interesting having these two data streams that we were collecting simultaneously to see exactly what the effects of white nose syndrome were. But we're still using acoustic surveys to monitor these bats because there are still threats out there affecting them. However, recently we've changed the surveys that we are using. So it used to be county-wide surveys. Now we've shrunk it down to something a little smaller. We're following the North American Bat Monitoring Program's protocol. And so this protocol enables us to standardize our data collection so we can compare data across states, tribes, and provinces to assess how an entire species is doing, rather than having to throw out data in between those agencies. And so you can see here on the map on the left, I have various colors that are coded in here. These are the groups of cells that we are currently surveying because it is most representative of Indiana's landscape, but that doesn't stop us from surveying other areas. So as we have interest and research needs, we may fill in some of these other gaps. And that's why knowing where volunteers are across the state and that you're interested in working with bats in this manner can be very beneficial to us. So some of these surveys essentially look like this. You're driving around on a country road, you might pass some cars, you might drive by houses. You may see some bats flying around in the illuminated night sky as the sun is setting. And as the sun goes down, you're maybe going to hear more frogs. You're going to see some wildlife crossing the road. But as you'll see on this bat detector here, you'll have lights coming on and flashing possibly. And that's an indication that you have bats in the area and it's actively recording their ultrasonic echolocation calls. So in addition to those mobile surveys, we're also conducting stationary detector surveys. And this involves putting out a stationary acoustic detector out in the landscape, either on a painter's pole or up on a tree or on a fence post even, and just leaving it out there for a week or a month. And we might need to swap out batteries or memory cards. But this stationary detector is really telling us, when are bats coming to this area and when are they leaving? And so thinking about the migratory bats that are coming through the state, we're really interested in getting more of these stationary detectors in this grid pattern in all these colored cells that you see here on the middle map. And then on the map on the right, we're interested in seeing around these locations that I have boxed in here. So all those dots on that map are current wind turbines on wind farms across Indiana. And it would be very handy to get some baseline information on when those migratory bats are coming through and get a sense of timing for when they're passing through these wind farms and when they're passing through areas between wind farms. That way we can have better information to inform future wind farm sites. Now, the second volunteer effort we have here is summer roost counts. And so I mentioned the summer months, bats roost in various things, and some bats are going to roost in human structures, and they can be barns or garages or attics, dead trees, live trees even, and bat boxes even. And what we need is volunteers who know that they have roosts on their property. So then you can go out there and count bats as they come and go from those roosts. And we don't need a lot of counts, maybe just 1 or 2 counts a month, from June through August. And that'll give us an idea of how many bats there are and whether or not you have a maternity colony, one of those groups of females that gives birth and raises young. So this is what observing a roost is going to look like. Sometimes we can do it with these acoustic surveys that we have with small detectors that fit into phones or iPads. We can bring our fancier detectors that are going to help us identify the bats. But what you get to do is just sort of sit out with friends and family in lawn chairs. You can do it by yourself too if you want. And you just get to watch bats come and go and count them as they leave their roost. And what you're going to see here in this video is some bats coming back and touching base and then leaving again. And what they're doing is they're trying to encourage some young that are getting ready to fly. Maybe they're still a little bit nervous about it. So those are the moms coming back in, swooping in, trying to give them that encouragement, showing them how to do it, and then leaving again. So it's really relaxing to just sort of sit out in the evening and count bats like this if you have a bat roost. So if this is something you would like to do and are interested in that, feel free to reach out to us. We'll put out some emails here shortly, so you can let us know that these are things you're interested in and that you do have roosts available on your property. Now, if you have a really large roost, like some people, we might have to break out the big guns and bring some thermal cameras down there to actually film the bats leaving that roost. It just becomes too difficult and overwhelming to try to count thousands of bats as they leave a roost. So this is a gray bat maternity colony that we have in Indiana, and there's almost 10,000 bats in there, and it quickly becomes difficult for 4 people to count this as the sun is setting and it becomes really dark without tools like thermal photography or thermal videography. So how can you help bats? Well, there are these volunteer monitoring efforts that I suggested, and there's an email at the bottom of the screen, helpbats@dnr.in.gov. And if you have roosts on your property and you would like to count them, we can get you the data sheets that we need filled out so that we can get the data we need. If you're interested in what species they are, we can even get some acoustic detectors up there, maybe even sample some guano to try to see which species are there. If you're interested in summer or fall acoustic surveys, please let us know. And if you're in these areas that I mentioned around, the wind farms in central northern Indiana or across any of these colored grid cells here, please let us know that as well, and we'd be able to help get you involved in next year's summer surveys. Now, there are even more ways you can help bats. So if none of those work for you, or even if they work for you and you want to help in further ways, you can definitely advocate for bats. So you can educate and share resources that you heard here tonight. You can go to batcon.org or batweek.org even and search some of the resources that they have there to explore, ways that you can help bats. There's plenty of activities on there. There's lots of FAQs. So if you have more bat questions that I didn't answer for you here tonight, you can search some of those resources or shoot me an email too, and I'll help you out. You can learn a lot of facts that can help you dispel myths that maybe you hear friends or family saying around certain times of year. And you can just shoot those down and say, well, actually, bats do this, and sort of break that myth cycle and prevent it from getting into that next generation. There's lots of great resources for how to host a Bat Week or Pollinator Day event out there. You can even join a local nonprofit that may actively work to help conserve bats, whether they're managing landscapes that support summer bat colonies, or they're actually managing caves that support winter bat colonies. There are plenty of them out there, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to have your membership. And finally, you can support policies that will benefit wildlife. So if you hear of legislation going through at the state or the federal level that is going to help wildlife, you can always call your legislator and say, hey, this is something that I'm very interested in. And hopefully we can get that snowball effect going and get them to actually get these policies into effect. Now, improving habitat is something we can all do if you have the area to do it. And I recognize that not a lot of people own property in Indiana. So if you have the ability to, plant a native garden in your yard, you can replace some lawn with some native pollinator seeds. That'll attract insects, and bats are going to feed on those insects. If you don't have the space and all you have is container garden on your apartment patio, that's perfectly fine too. Plant some native seeds there, and you're going to be helping those insects, which is going to indirectly help the bats. You can build and install bat boxes, but as you do this, go through the literature on batcon.org to make sure that you're building one of the right size, so you're not creating a heat trap for bats. And if you have property and you need to remove trees for any reason, try to remove those trees in the winter months so that you're getting those out of there when bats are off the landscape, when they're either in hibernation or they're down south for the winter. And one last note before I let you guys go for the Q&A, and I hopefully can answer all your questions. I just wanted to point out that the mission of the Indiana Division of Fish and Wildlife is what brings me here today. And that mission is to enrich the quality of life for present and future generations by balancing many benefits of Indiana's fish and wildlife and their habitat. And we do this through a number of ways, but one of them is the American system of conservation funding. So by selling hunting, fishing, and trapping licenses and the materials that go into all of those activities, some of those excise taxes get pooled by the federal government and redistributed to the states in the form of state wildlife grants. and Pittman-Robertson funds that we can then use to manage some of these species and to conduct research projects on these species. And this is actually how I get a lot of work done on bats here in the state. Additionally, we have the Indiana Nongame Wildlife Fund, and we have recently redesigned the website. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Nongame Wildlife Fund last year. You can go through that story map and learn about a lot of past and ongoing projects, a lot of great partners, and ways you can get involved too. And also on here, we have a non-game newsletter that you can sign up for, so you can keep up to date with updates that we have from the field on ongoing projects that are supported by this Indiana Non-Game Wildlife Fund. And finally, I'd definitely like to thank the sources of funding I have for a lot of the bat work that I'm able to conduct here in the state, including the Indiana Non-Game Wildlife Fund, state wildlife grants, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's white nose syndrome grants to states, which has definitely helped go a long way towards the monitoring, research, and conservation of Indiana's bats. So with that, I want to thank you. I'm going to try to go back and play some sounds with those videos so that you guys can actually hear that while questions are rolling in. But I want to thank you. Here's my email. I know Mariah gave her email as well, but I appreciate your time tonight, and hopefully we can get some sound on videos for you to check out. All right.
Thank you so much, Brad. I will let you try to get your sound working there while I go through some of these questions. So we have a lot of good ones tonight. The first question is about something that a lot of people think of when they think of bats, and we want to make sure that everybody has good information on it. So, do bats have rabies? And if they do have rabies, how do they get rabies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here in Indiana, bats are the #1 mammal for vectoring rabies. Rabies is a virus that affects mammals, and almost any mammal can contract it. And bats just happen to be the one that move it around in the state. There's numerous variants of rabies, so there's like skunk rabies, fox rabies, things like that. But here in Indiana, we only have bat rabies. And it's actually something that's very rare. So the number of bats that get submitted to the state health lab is probably 400 to 500 bats that are presumed to be sick. And of those, only 10 to 20 a year test positive for rabies. So it's something that occurs very, very rarely. A figure that we usually reference is it's less than 1% of bats on the environment. And any given time of the year, we have at least 200,000 bats in Indiana. So that's hardly any bats that have rabies. So it's not something that I'm overly afraid of. But if you have a bat in your house, for example, you want to make sure that no one's been in contact with that bat. And if no one has, you can just open up a door or a window and let that animal fly away. So it's something to be aware of and something to teach kids. So if they see a bat, teach them not to grab it, to come get an adult so that you can monitor who's around that and you can get it reported or tested if need be.
Thank you, Brad. That's really helpful. We have another question here about from a customer who has a bat box with a small number of bats on their property, so about 100 bats. And then this summer, during an extreme heat event, that customer had a number of pups and adults fall from that box. They noticed heavy numbers of bat bugs on them and wondered, at what numbers do these bugs become detrimental to the bat or the colony, and is there any way to control these bugs?
That's a great question. Wow. I know of no way to control the bat bugs. It seems like bats are able to move those around between roosts. So they might move them from a cave to another roost. And in any given area, bats can have multiple roosts that they're using. So even though they're using your bat box, they might have at least like 3 or 4 others that they know of. And maybe they'll go to, when it's colder because it's a little bit warmer in this other roost, or when your roost gets a little too hot, they might go to another one. But I don't know of any good ways to remove bat bugs. I think the best way is just to let nature take its course. The thing that's affecting those bats the most is definitely the extreme heat. So if you continue to see that happening to your bats, I would even consider buying or building a larger bat box that has more chambers. So they make 1, 2, 3, and 4 chambered bat boxes. There's other designs too. Essentially, the larger the bat box, the more habitats within that bat box that they can choose from. Should it get too hot, they can move to a cooler section. So I would consider doing that before thinking of anything to do with bat bugs.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Brad. It looks like we have a few minutes left for some more questions, so we'll go ahead and do that, and I'll make sure to save some time at the end for those sounds to come through.
I got them right here for you.
Oh, you do? Okay, well, we can go ahead and do that first.
Okay. All right, so these are some of those echolocation. Oh, I didn't do it right. Never mind.
No worries, Brad.
Okay, if you see it now, it may work. Ah. There you go. All right, so these are all slowed down and put at a frequency that we can hear, but they all sound very unique.
That's awesome. They sound so cool. So you can actually determine which bat species are which based on their sound. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we run these calls through an auto identifier program, which uses characteristics of the calls, so like the slope of the call and things like that to identify them. We have enough experience in the cars listening to these things that we can maybe get close to guesstimating what they are, but it really comes down to running it through the program to get accurate identification.
Gotcha. Thank you, Brad. So we have a couple more questions here. Can you tell us how much property a person needs to have in order to have a bat box?
Well, you don't need much property to have a bat box. You might want to check with like an HOA if you live within the bounds of one of those to see if it's okay to get one of those up. But honestly, you can put a bat box up on the side of a building as long as it's at least 10 feet off the ground. You can put it up on a tree, although it's not ideal, but like getting it up on a post, something like that is excellent. Bat boxes, even if bats don't use them, they're going to recognize that there's additional habitat on the landscape and they may use it. And I like to point out that even if a bat uses a bat box once, because they come back to our landscape and they find out that, their favorite roost has fallen down finally, and they need that emergency shelter, they could use that once, and that thing has served its purpose of helping bats. And if you get bats that keep coming back, that's great. You just have to make sure that you are keeping up with it so that you don't actually harm bats during like one of those high heat events, or having, too many wasps, or allowing raccoons to climb up there, things like that.
Gotcha. It looks like we have another question about bat boxes. A person is wanting to hang the bat box over their garden, but they've been hesitant to do so because of the guano that the bats produce. So is that safe to hang near or over a garden?
Yes, that is definitely a safe thing to hang near and over a garden. As I mentioned, it's not a field of dreams situation where if you build it, they will come. But if you put it up, there's a chance they will come. And then there's a chance that they can drop that highly nutritious guano onto your flower bed or your garden, which will definitely help your plants out. So I would recommend doing it. If you do get bats and there's guano produced there, I would recommend gently stirring that guano into your soil, maybe watering it down first gently and then stirring it in. You don't want to jostle it too much and then breathe in any fecal particles, things like that.
Awesome. Thank you. So it looks like we have a whole lot of interest in people helping to volunteer or to help support bats on their property, which is great. So I just wanted to point out that folks who are interested in becoming active in our volunteer monitoring opportunities for bats, or active in supporting the bat population in some other way, can reach out to Brad or I. We both put our email addresses there in the chat. So please reach out if we don't get to your specific question today. If you have questions in general regarding bats or questions about becoming involved, that way we can touch base with you. We do have another question here that does relate to that, and I think we have time for one more question here. So can you tell us how long a person needs to sit outside and watch a bat roost for the summer roost count? So maybe they don't have a whole lot of time to help, but they want to help bats. What's the best way to help bats when time is limited?
Yeah, great question. So the time period that we're looking for is, from sunset till about an hour after sunset. And in that period, bats are going to start coming out as it's getting twilight and a little bit dark. Most of your bats are going to leave the roost at that time to go start looking for insects. They're going to come back and go in numerous times throughout the night to warm up and maybe digest their meals. But really, just that hour after sunset is what we're looking for. So hopefully it's not too long. If it does become an issue, we have other volunteers and maybe we can get out to you to help get that roost counted. So you don't have to feel totally excluded if you don't have the time to actually count it.
Awesome. And it looks like we have a couple of questions regarding something that you said recently. So you were talking about the bat bugs and about making sure that your bat boxes don't have too many wasps. Can you explain just what bat bugs are if we don't know, and then also how wasps harm bats or what the deal is with them?
Yeah. So I'll start with the wasps first. So in an unused bat box, you can have mud daubers and other paper wasps actually create their nests in there. It's a nice hollow structure, so that's plenty of room for them to build those structures in there. And if bats aren't in there, they're going to be more inclined to do so. So if you actually clear those wasp nests out while they're small so that it can open up that area for bats to use. So bats essentially aren't going to use a bat box that has a whole bunch of wasps in it, which makes sense. And then in terms of bat bugs, they're sort of like a very large flea for bats. They're almost like a tick. So they take a small blood meal from these bats, they process that, and then they produce eggs in that roost. Their larvae are going to then get on next bats and then continue the cycle. So they're sort of like fleas and ticks where they're going to take a blood meal off those animals. And they have phenomenal little claws so they can cling on to a bat's individual hair follicles and hold on as the bat's flying miles and miles away to their next roost.
Awesome. I know I said one more question a question ago, but there's so many good ones. I just can't stop. Okay, I'm going to make this the actual last one. Can you tell us if there are any specific policies in the works? So earlier you talked about different legislative policies that could potentially impact bat conservation moving forward. Are there any current policies in the works, either in Indiana or federally, that would be really beneficial for bats?
Yeah, so there is one that's been trying to get off the ground federally called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And that one would provide states with a significantly larger pool of money to enact conservation and enact management plans in their region. And so this is something that would pale in comparison to what we've been using currently. That's just a drop in the bucket compared to what Recovering America's Wildlife Act could allow us to do. That would help us get potentially personnel that we need to cover the state a lot more effectively, get the tools and equipment that would really help with a lot of the monitoring and things like that. So there are some in the works, and hopefully with more support, it can actually happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate it. I wanted to just say a quick thank you to everybody for taking the time to be here today. Thank you, Brad, for teaching us about bats. I know that I learned a whole bunch today, so I hope the audience had as much fun as I did learning about bats. To everyone in attendance, thank you for taking your valuable time to join us. Please let us know in the question and answer section if there's a topic that you're thinking of that you might like to hear our next webinar on. So we're always looking for different opportunities to share with the public. So if you have a favorite species or just a favorite conservation question or topic that you would like to hear about, please put that in the question and answer so we can have that for consideration. And then you can also keep an eye out for future webinars from the Division of Fish and Wildlife by monitoring our website and our social media accounts and following that that Nongame Wildlife Fund newsletter that we put in the chat earlier. So if you have follow-up questions, like I mentioned before, please email myself or Brad. We'll be happy to get back with you, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.